For the News and Observer, I'm Capitol Bureau Chief and Under the Dome host Dawn Vaughan for this latest episode for the week of May 20th, 2024. I'm here today with my politics team colleagues Bajpai and Luciana, Perez, Uribe, Guinassi, as we tell you what to expect this week at the General Assembly and some choice highlights from the prior week. One thing we need to point out, not legislative, but legislature adjacent, the Republican runoff for lieutenant governor and auditor happened this past week. So the official Republican candidates going on to the general are Republican Hal Weatherman versus State Senator Rachel Hunt for lieutenant governor, and for auditor Dave Bullock versus Jessica Holmes, who Governor Cooper appointed to replace Beth Wood. Rachel Hunt, you should know, is already a state senator and still in this session. So the day after the runoff, she basically drew a line between her and Weatherman on abortion, and she filed a constitutional amendment bill in the Senate, which does not have a chance of going anywhere because to put an amendment on the ballot in North Carolina, you have to have 3/5, which is a supermajority in both the House and the Senate to put it there. So it's basically a messaging bill, and that's kind of what we'll probably see more of this session. So back to the in the weeds of in the building. We're headed now to maybe our first veto and subsequent veto override watch. As I mentioned, with the supermajority, House and Senate each have enough Republicans to overturn Cooper's vetoes. And the most controversial bills so far are, past one chamber, not both. So part of it's going to be timing of things picking up. There's going to be more funding for the Opportunity Scholarship Program, which are the private school tuition vouchers. Then there's the ICE bill, and then this bill that just passed the Senate about basically going back to the previous mask law before COVID, and that's tied to the protesters at UNC wearing masks and everything else, and brought a lot of floor debate. But let's talk first about ICE, since that is coming up this week, it looks like, as far as what Rules Chair Hall told us recently. You've been following this for a long time.
Yeah, so the Senate passed. The Senate, was sitting on this ICE bill that the House passed in 2023 for all of that year, didn't take it up, and then took it up when lawmakers convened for the session this year pretty quickly. But they amended the bill, senators amended the bill to include this enforcement provision that basically, would try to ensure that sheriffs actually do comply with the bill. The whole point of this bill, the reason why this fight has been happening, Republicans have been trying to pass this for several years, is because some sheriffs in Democratic counties, Wake, Mecklenburg, Durham, Orange, some other counties, have campaigned on and insisted on limiting their cooperation with ICE. Republicans are trying to make sure that they do cooperate. So where we are right now is that the Senate passed this bill, sent it back to the House with that change. The House this past week decided instead of concurring with that change, they're going to go into conference committee mode, and
which is basically the top lawmakers. It's not a committee like we get to go and watch a debate. They're just going to make the decision.
It's going to be a handful of Republicans, Destin Hall among them in the House, and they're going to sort of go over some final changes to the bill. And Representative Hall told us this past week that that conference report, the sort of like finalized version of the bill, could be ready for final votes in the House and Senate this week. So we could see it going to Governor Cooper's desk potentially this week. Governor Cooper's vetoed similar bills twice before. So if this bill moves this week, this could be the first veto override showdown of this session.
If it does. And Hall told us, after the session that if it doesn't happen this week, it definitely will happen this legislative session.
Yeah.
And it's pretty much guaranteed a veto from Cooper. Another potential veto, if the House ends up passing it, is the mask bill, which had some debate in the Senate a few days ago that was kind of just all over the place. Some long-winded Senate floor speeches, some shorter one. At one point, Democratic Senator Paul Lowe put a mask on and turned around. He sits on kind of this, the way the Senate chamber looks as sort of this like half-circle desk, and in the back to the left corner and the right corner is where the press corps sits. And so Lowe turned around wearing his mask to make sure, of course, all the reporters saw it. It was to make a point. And then when he got up to make his speech against Senator Buck Newton, I believe, saying like, well, you can still recognize me. And a lot of the discussion and debate was about the language in the bill to make sure that people who are wearing it for health reasons aren't going to have any trouble as a result. And Republicans argue that it's about people not being able to see your face and, really framing it more in the criminal way, which was what the law was years ago, as we talked about on the podcast before.
This one definitely also seems like it really could be headed towards, it already received a party line vote in the Senate. This one seems like it could be headed towards another veto and overrides showdown. What's interesting, kind of intriguing, is that in committee there was actually what seemed like somewhat productive dialogue between both parties, members of both parties, about the Democrats raising concerns that, well, if you remove, basically, this exception was only put in place during COVID. So between this mask ban went into effect in 1953, I believe. So between then and 2020, there was no health and safety exception.
And people still randomly wore masks for
people wore masks, but I think what people say is the argument is that masking really became prevalent because of and during and after COVID.
Right. It
wasn't as commonplace as it is now.
And now it's more something that we've seen at protests. So another bill that passed the Senate that isn't quite as controversial. Luciana, you've been watching this, the juvenile justice bill. So I heard some of the concerns about how this would raise the age. Is that how much of a concern is that, and how much of that is the reality of it actually rolling back some of that?
Yeah, so the juvenile justice bill passed the Senate, pretty much, bipartisan support, no debate. But in committees, it did face some debate. And that was largely from advocates, ACLU, Disability North Carolina, and a slew of other organizations. That said that this bill would raise back protections for youth who commit crimes. So raise the age basically allowed 16 and 17-year-olds to have their cases tried first in juvenile court instead of going directly to adult court. And this bill here is going to change that order. So basically cases are going to go directly to adult court, and then they could potentially go back down. So advocates are concerned about that and saying that it's, really stepping back from raise the age. But I guess that's kind of remained to be seen, but that bill didn't really face controversy, at least from lawmakers. So
I was looking up the no's were on the Democratic side were Bodie, Grafstein, Murdoch, and Robinson. And raise the age was like such a big deal for so long. I remember the many, many years of people pushing for it, and the teenagers that were impacted by it, and then it eventually moving forward. I believe when Senator McKissick was part of that, the former Democratic senator. Yeah. All right, we are almost out of time before the break. When we come back, we're going to talk about what Democrats' moves are this session, play you a clip from Rules Chair Dustin Hall about the chances of the discharge petition that Democratic State Rep Marcia Morey announced this few days ago, and then our picks for Headliner of the Week. We'll be right back.
Score more with the college-branded Venmo debit card and earn up to 5% cash back with Venmo Stash. Got paid back? With the Venmo debit card, you can instantly access your balance and spend on what you want, like game day snacks, gear, tickets, and more. The more you do, the more cash back you can earn. Plus, there's no monthly fee or minimum balance. Sign up now at Venmo.com/collegecard. The Venmo MasterCard is issued by the Bancorp Bank N.A. Select schools available. Venmo Stash terms and exclusions apply at venmo.me/stash terms. Max $100 cash back per month.
You're listening to Under the Dome. I'm Capitol Bureau Chief Don Vaughan, here with Luciana, Perez, Uribe, Guinassi, and Avi Bajpai. Before the break, we're kind of on like veto watch once the most controversial bills change and the connection to mass and the UNC protests. I wanted to make sure that people knew and to clarify on the podcast last week when I was talking with higher ed reporter Corey Dean about UNC Chancellor Lee Roberts being picked by Republican leadership. And Corey pointed out that's for Board of Governors. That's why I wanted to reiterate that people know we talked about Roberts being picked by the legislative Republican leadership for Board of Governors, not his actual job as chancellor. So moving on to what's going on in the building, one thing Democrats have been doing lately is kind of testing Republicans, and some of it is the GovOps, the Democratic members of GovOps. You can read our coverage about that, trying to get documents themselves. Another method are discharge petitions. So after the House session on, I think it was Wednesday, Rules Chair Destin Hall talked to a couple of reporters, and this was right after Representative Maury announced that she was going to file these discharge petitions for a red flag bill, which are the extreme risk protection orders. And what was the other one, Avi?
Safe storage, unattended vehicles.
Right. Yeah. So this is what Representative Hall said. The chances are of Maury's discharge petition moving on these gun bills.
Well, if she gets 61 members to go in there and sign, there would be a chance. I doubt that happens in this session. At this point, I don't see there being any real desire out of our caucus to move forward on those bills. But we'll see if she gets 61 in there. I don't see a line out here right now, so I don't know.
So as you heard from Destin Hall, looks like it's not going anywhere. And if him saying at the end is, I don't see a line, as we're just standing by the House door right across from the House Clerk's office, which is where you file discharge petitions. Avi, you went by there on Thursday. How many signatures are there?
Yeah, so both petitions had 16 signatures. Of course, you need 61. So even if all Democrats in the House, for example, all 48 of them were to sign on, they'd still be, I want to say 13 signatures short. I mean, this isn't really surprising, but this is kind of this has sort of been the status quo on this issue and some other issues. And, Democrats will keep kind of trying to make these kind of high profile issues and raise awareness about them. But I don't know, we've been talking about compromise on gun bills for years now, several years, and there's never really been any scope for that,
especially in an election year.
Yeah,
I mean, you could make it more of an issue. Representative Maury, she's a former judge. This is just her issue all the time. Yeah. That's something that's really important to her. A couple other things to watch. Representative Jake Johnson said this past week that there could be some movement on the academic transparency bill in the House. I asked Speaker Moore about it, and the gist that I got, my takeaway was he hasn't looked at it yet, and he'll let Education Committee take that on. So that's probably not going to have any movement yet. Also on the potential for a tax rebate that Senator Leader Berger mentioned, because Berger has said multiple times when the state collects more money than it needs from the taxpayers, you should basically put it in savings or give it back to them. More supported Berger's idea of yes, for rebates, but it would be if it's significant enough. And then more kind of segued from that into talking about capital needs that could be in the budget. And other things we're looking at is the vouchers. Is it going to be as much money as they initially wanted to add? And we're looking at a lot of stuff.
And also, is it going to be a standalone bill, or is it going to be put back into the budget and run through the budget?
Right, and that could be another thing. And then, Luciana, there was something else that has bipartisan support with IDD. Where is that?
Yeah, so that also involves money. So basically an omnibus bill that has a lot of provisions on things, so that people with disabilities can get better resources in the state. One of those things is the innovations waiver, which is a program for people to get, help, direct support professionals to help them at home and various other things. And also basically making sure there's not that backlog in that innovations program is a main thing in the bill that bipartisan lawmakers have put forth, and then also the raising the wages of DSP workers, so those direct care professionals. And that has bipartisan support. Democratic Reps Zach Hawkins and Sarah Crawford, as well as Reps Donna White, Republican, and John Bradford, also Republican. But, whether that actually passes, where it's going, I guess will be seen in the next few weeks.
So we're seeing bipartisan support of some things like the child care needs. That's something both Republicans and Democrats have talked about wanting to fund. Let's move on to our picks for headliner of the week. Avi, why don't you go first since we're talking about bipartisanship?
Yeah.
This is a fun one.
Yeah, this was something that caught our attention as we were watching the House this past week, but it looks like couple of House members, Representatives Caleb Rudow, Laura Budd, and Jared Lowry, sent out an email to their colleagues inviting them to do a bipartisan skydive, maybe later this month or early next month, basically with two goals: one, to raise money for local food banks in members' districts, but also to sort of like foster some camaraderie, get everyone sort of bonding. And as Representative Rudow was saying, what better way to do it than jumping out of a plane? So
I believe Rules Chair Hall quipped that he'd see them once they're back on the ground.
Yeah. They say adrenaline unites people, feel closer.
So I haven't forgotten that a couple of years ago when there's still e-scooters all over the place, but when they were as prevalent as cicadas, I guess. I was promised a bipartisan scooter race, and I haven't seen it yet. So
seems a lot safer.
We're still waiting on that. Someone would probably bust it. Yeah. So, all right, Luciana, who or what is your headliner of the week?
So mine is taking the time to travel across North Carolina. I was recently on vacation for a week, and I went to Newland. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. If that's your county, your district, your area, let me know.
Avery County, right?
Yes, Avery County. And it's very beautiful. It was quite misty, so I didn't really see the mountains that well, but I think it was still really lovely. So,
all right. So it's Senator Heiss's district, and so he can tell us more about it next time in the Senate. My headliner of the week, as people probably are already aware, Billy Graham is the latest North Carolinian to have a statue in the U.S. Capitol. So, of course, all the North Carolina political leaders had to go or wanted to go. So that's Governor Roy Cooper, that's Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson, that's Senate Leader Phil Berger, and House Speaker Tim Moore. So who's running the state? It's a big free-for-all now. There's a statute for that, which I found out. And so the lieutenant governor is acting governor when the governor is not just out of the country, out of the state. Obviously, this is an old-timey law. And we have the internet now, and you don't have to be, 5 miles from the mansion. But that's what it is. So the full succession, I guess, line of who would be acting, since, again, Cooper, Berger, Robinson, Moore were in D.C., would be the Secretary of State, Elaine Marshall. She is the next one in charge, followed by the auditor, the treasurer, the superintendent of public instruction, then the attorney general, commissioner of ag, commissioner of labor, and lastly, commissioner of insurance. So that's who will run the show if there's some sort of surprise need while everyone is out of state. That's all the time we have. I'm Dawn Vaughan for Luciana and Avi and everyone at the NNO. Thanks for listening, and we will talk to you next time.
For more from our politics team, subscribe to the News and Observer at newsobserver.com/subscribe. Follow us on Twitter at Under the Dome and NC Insider, and sign up for our weekly political newsletter, also called Under the Dome, at newsobserver.com/newsletters. Thanks for listening.